It's September 2nd, 2006. Ohio State is playing their first game of the 2006 season against a decent but not great Northern Illinois team. It's considered to be a tune-up game for the top-ranked Buckeyes. Well, hey, there's Troy Smith. We're about 8 minutes into this game, and he's going to end it with a 50-yard throw down the field to this guy, Ted Ginn, giving Ohio State an early 14-0 lead that the Buckeyes never looked back from. This connection, Smith to Ginn, became pretty common in 2006. It was a big reason that the Buckeyes entered the year ranked at number 1. They had actually connected even earlier in the game as well, but let's look at this one first.
On 1st and 10, a little play fake, and he's going downtown and has a man. Ginn, touchdown Buckeyes!
Throws like these were hardly rare from Troy Smith. In what was now his second season as a full-time starter and third seeing significant playing time, Smith had already established himself as one of the nation's most prolific passers. He was expected to take the step from good to great in 2006, and, well, he didn't disappoint. Hell, that may be an understatement. Troy Smith lit it up. He lit it up against weak foes like Northern Illinois, Bowling Green and Northwestern, and strong ones like Texas and Michigan. He launched the football all over the field to his assortment of top receiving options all year long and found so much success that he was named the nation's best player just days after the Buckeyes secured a national title berth following their win over Michigan. Troy was outstanding. He was borderline unstoppable, and the only real answer for him was to load up your backfield, allowing Antonio Pittman and Beanie Wells to run free underneath. For 12 games, Ohio State, and by extension Troy Smith, did exactly what we thought they could do, and in some cases more. They kicked off the season by dominating Northern Illinois, turned around and immediately did the same to a much tougher opponent, second-ranked Texas, in Austin. If it wasn't for the Michigan game, this game may have been considered Smith's magnum opus of his Heisman campaign. He was masterful against the excellent Longhorns defense, slashing them up for nearly 300 yards on 17 of 26 passing. He added 2 touchdowns, including this beautiful toss to, you guessed it, Ted Ginn to give the Buckeyes the lead heading into the half.
Throwing deep, Ginn runs it in, touchdown!
Now, Smith wasn't perfect because no quarterback is. He struggled with Penn State's blitz-heavy defense and tossed 2 avoidable, at least in my opinion, interceptions. The Buckeyes survived thanks to 2 defensive touchdowns from their defense that was, awesome in 2006. But it was still a flash of mortality from Smith. He responded by becoming the best quarterback in college football.
Ohio State. Troy Smith flushed. Tim Shaw giving chase. Reverses his field. Got a block from Pittman. Going deep. He's got a man in the end zone. Touchdown! Ohio State. It's Robisky.
He threw 14 touchdowns and 1,014 yards on just under 70% completion percentage over the next 5 games against Iowa, Bowling Green, Michigan State, Indiana, and Minnesota. Most impressively, after the 2 that he threw against Penn State, Troy threw 0 interceptions in this span. It wasn't until more than a month and a half later against Illinois that he would finally throw another. He was unstoppable. He was like a demigod. It was almost unhuman how good he was during this span. That's the thing that was so difficult to stop about Troy and really about that team as a whole. It was the ultimate Jim Tressel team, skilled enough to step on your neck, smart enough to never let you back up. Troy didn't put up unholy numbers because he didn't need to. He made the smart throw almost every single time and never gave his opponent a free takeaway. Every throw had purpose, and every throw had to be contested if you wanted to stop it, because he wasn't going to miss on his own. There's no better example of this than the game of the century, Ohio State-Michigan, November 18th, 2006. Troy had games in this season where he was more effective or more dangerous than against Michigan, but at no point during the entire season did he shine brighter than in the biggest game of the regular season, not just Ohio State's, but college football's entire regular season. He was the perfect maestro for Ohio State's offense, distributing the ball to 8 different targets, tossing 4 touchdowns, completing just over 70% of his passes, and racking up 316 yards. He gashed Michigan's vaunted defense all day long. Down the field, across the middle, to the outsides, underneath, he hit everything. Picked apart the Michigan defense piece by piece. Then, with the game on the line, drove a stake through Michigan's heart with a touchdown pass to Brian Robisky with 5.5 minutes to spare.
End zone. Got it.
It gave the Buckeyes an 11-point lead that they had no plans to surrender. In the biggest moment of the college football season, under the lights, Troy Smith put up a Heisman-caliber performance that few players matched before or since. I think you know the story after that, so I really don't think I need to tell it in detail. Ohio State and Troy Smith falls apart against Florida and loses in emphatic fashion in the national championship game. Troy has the worst game of his career, spends the entire night running away from linemen that his offensive line can't stop, and never finds any traction. The Buckeyes, to put it bluntly, got their ass whooped by a more prepared and, frankly, better team. Troy graduated and turned his focus to the next level. The Heisman winner was certainly talked about in NFL circles, but thanks to his showing against Florida and his subpar 6-foot flat frame, the chatter was not necessarily good. The NFL was going through a phase, and that phase can be defined by the top quarterbacks in Troy's class. Jamarcus Russell, Brady Quinn, Kevin Kolb, John Beck, Drew Stanton, and Trent Edwards. What do those 6 have in common? A big arm and a big number in the height column. Russell was the biggest and strongest of the bunch, and he went first overall. Quinn, at 6'4", went to the Browns at 22. Kolb, Beck, and Stanton were drafted in the second round, and Edwards in the third. After the more prestigious rounds passed, a few more quarterbacks came off the board, namely Isaiah Stanback in the 4th and John Rowe early in the 5th. Stanback was 6'3", Rowe was 6'4". It wasn't until much later in the 5th round, at pick 174, that the Heisman winner, Ohio State's most electric quarterback ever, would come off the board. The NFL had made a resounding statement with its treatment of Smith. No short quarterbacks. Not now. This didn't go undiscussed during the lead up to and the aftermath of that draft. Smith was a hotly debated topic. The issue was that the debate was usually ignored by the NFL decision makers, and, well, we already knew how they felt. There were hundreds of newspaper columns, articles, and takes out there on Smith. In the Detroit Free Press on November 26, 2006, 3 fans on a 4-fan panel said they wanted the hometown Lions to take Smith with the 2nd pick in the draft. The Lions would instead draft Calvin Johnson before grabbing Drew Stanton a round later. A lot of the pre-Florida draft talk for Smith was like this, positive. Not all, of course, as plenty were still put off by his height, but the discourse was much friendlier to Smith before January and before the national title. On January 29th, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch claimed that Smith's draft stock was trending down. Draft writer Jerry Jones, of the drugstore list, not the Cowboys, said on January 14th in the Springfield News-Sun that Troy Smith could get bumped out of the first round. On the same page, Gil Brandt called himself a Smith fan and warned against judging too much from one game. Vince Newsom expressed a similar sentiment, while Frank Coyle seemed to say the exact opposite. A few months later, analyst Mike Mayock was quoted in the Star-Tribune as saying that Troy Smith is an easy evaluation and that he sees him as a third-round quarterback. He also claimed that Smith made 80 to 90% of his plays outside of the tackle box, which, along with being completely untrue, manages to miss the mark by an almost astounding amount. Mayock is now, of course, the GM of the Oakland Raiders because the NFL is a good league with a lot of really smart people in it. One of the most significant articles on Smith that I can find from the time is actually from a familiar face, Jamel Hill, who was a columnist with ESPN's Page 2 at the time. Hill penned a scathing critique of the way the NFL was shunning Smith, citing the success of Michael Vick and Drew Brees as examples that vertically challenged quarterbacks can still succeed in the NFL. She mentioned Smith's excellent numbers, his excellent decision-making, and his 10-1 record against ranked foes, all significantly better than that of his peers. A specific paragraph really jumps out to me as significant. Everything about Smith screams he is the wrong player to overlook. Yet, that is exactly what will happen in April, even though he had a college career that was better than one of the most glorified quarterbacks in recent memory. But in the NFL, measurements are more valued than film. Stopwatches are trusted more than instinct. The whole piece is a really illuminating look at the relatively minimal differences between the NFL 12 years ago and the NFL now. And you should read the whole thing. I've linked it in the description. I mention minimal differences because largely the NFL still tends to fall in love with lumbering, massive quarterbacks while overlooking more prolific passers with maybe less impressive physical profiles, it still tends to draft Josh Allen and Daniel Jones in the top 10, and it still tends to condemn much more talented players like Lamar Jackson to the back end of the first round. There has, however, been one pretty major change. It's a change that brings us to the point of this whole video and the key that my hypothetical revolves around. In back-to-back years, the NFL has thrown their concern with short quarterbacks to the wind. Baker Mayfield was the first pick in 2018, and Kyler Murray followed that in 2019. Mayfield is 6'1" on a good day, and Kyler Murray is 5'10" at best. Both were absolutely stunning in college, and both were drafted because of their play on the field rather than their measurables or potential. Baker was the best rookie quarterback by a mile in 2018, and Murray is one of the most hyped quarterback prospects in years. While the NFL still holds quite a few of its sensibilities near and dear, it seems to have finally caught on to what the college football world has known for at least a decade. Talent is talent, regardless of size. So, what can we do with all of this information? How in the world does Troy Smith relate to all of this? How does he relate to Baker Mayfield and Kyler Murray? Well, I have a bit of a theory. I think that if Troy Smith played college football a decade and some change later than he did at Ohio State under a Ryan Day offense, he would have been considered a first-round caliber quarterback by the more height-flexible version of the NFL. Let's prove it. To start, we need to understand exactly who Troy Smith was as a player in 2006 and how his talents, traits, and weaknesses would apply to modern football. Because more teams than ever are running spread offenses, Smith's success and numbers in Jim Tressel's more conservative offense can't be used as a direct comparison to the actual quarterback class of 2019. If Smith is hypothetically playing in 2019 rather than 2007, we have to consider how that would impact his numbers and his skills as a player. So how do we do that? Well, using Troy Smith's numbers from 2 years of starting at Ohio State and the numbers of Ohio State's starting quarterbacks in the 2 years that Ryan Day has coordinated the offense, we can create a fairly strong forecast of what Smith may have been able to do under the pass-heavy coach in an offense built to deliver quarterbacks to the next level. When you input all of those numbers into this projection machine, we get a stat line suited for, well, a Heisman contender and a first-round caliber quarterback. 67.2 completion percentage, 3,730 yards, 42 touchdowns, 8 interceptions, and an adjusted yards per attempt of about 9.6. On their own, these numbers are impressive, sure, but relatively meaningless. Without context, stats are nothing, and to give them context, we need more players. Namely, we need the 2018 stats of the 5 quarterbacks that were drafted in the first 3 rounds of the 2019 NFL Draft. Kyler Murray, Daniel Jones, Dwayne Haskins, Drew Lock, and Will Grier. With their profiles to compare Smith's to, we can actually start to flesh out where Troy would have stood in the hypothetical season with his hypothetical stats. As you might have imagined, he compares favorably to just about every top quarterback in the draft in really every single category that matters. He's 3rd in completion percentage behind only Kyler Murray and Dwayne Haskins, 4th in adjusted yards per attempt, but still sits far ahead of both Drew Lock and Daniel Jones. 2nd in touchdowns, 4th in quarterback rate. Smith is, by all accounts, right up there with each of the 3 quarterbacks in this class that came off the board in round 1. When you look at the radar for all of these stats, this becomes even more apparent. Jones and Lock are a very obvious 5 and 6. Kyler Murray is an obvious 1. Dwayne Haskins is an obvious 2. The discussion between 3 and 4 between Smith and Grier is a complicated one, but depending on what a team values, I think both could be argued for either spot. Either way, it's very obvious that Smith's simulated stats will put him firmly in the discussion of first-round quarterbacks. As we know, stats are far from the only thing NFL teams look at when scouting a potential franchise quarterback. It's far more granular than that. They look at measurables, intangibles, things that can't really be given a true, objective rating in a spreadsheet. Most importantly, they look at tape to figure out who the player is beyond numbers on a page. To take this hypothetical a step further, I did just that for Troy Smith. Using his 2006 season, I put together a comprehensive scouting report that looks something like what an NFL front office might have on a prospective draftee. I looked at every one of his games in 2006, graded each game and each throw to get a better idea of who Troy Smith was as a prospect. As I mentioned earlier, Ohio State's offense in 2006 cannot be directly transferred onto football in 2019. It was a fundamentally different style, and because of that, Smith's hypothetical scouting report has to operate a little bit differently than usual scouting reports. I looked less at his overall body of work and more at specific plays, specific traits that stood out to me, either positive or negative, that I think could apply to a modern offense. That means he can throw slants really well or drag routes, and less how good he is at dropping back from under center. Obviously, this is highly subjective, but such is life when operating in hypotheticals. So, what do we know about Troy Smith on the field and not just in a spreadsheet? Well, Troy's best trait at Ohio State was his ability as a playmaker. He wasn't fast by any means, but he thrived when plays broke down and was able to shred defenses down the field when he escaped the pocket and had time to work his magic. The only quarterback anywhere near Troy's broken play acumen in this class is probably Kyler Murray, though his offense rarely allowed for plays to last long enough to break down. For a short quarterback, that ability to just make something happen, to thrive even when the line breaks down, can cover up a lot of the issues that come with being just 6 feet tall. Troy wasn't just a boomer-bust big play quarterback. He had tremendous fundamentals, a fluid, repeatable throwing motion, and a lightning-quick release. Because of that, he was able to generate a ton of force on throws across the middle and to the outside. In fact, he owned the middle of the field as much as anyone in college football and has a similar command between the hashes to someone like Baker Mayfield. That only gets better in Ryan Day's air raid offense. There are plenty of smaller pluses in his game too. Troy was, by all accounts, a great leader and had all of the intangibles that the NFL loves to talk about. He runs a mean play action and frequently flashed the ability to look off defenders to create room for his passes. He was technically advanced beyond his years, and that, paired with his solid throwing motion and middle-of-the-field dominance, would make him the highest floor quarterback in this hypothetical draft class. Now, Smith obviously wasn't perfect, and I'm not here to argue that he was. His ceiling is capped by his frequent struggles with downfield accuracy, and because accuracy is the hardest thing to develop, I think his relative inability as a deep ball thrower limits him to a good but not great starter, which changes his hypothetical draft projection a bit. Some teams want to hit home runs and may not have any interest in the easy double. On top of that, Smith was overconfident at times, trusting his arm a bit too much, which caused almost every single one of his few interceptions. It's rare, but it does happen. That brings us to the final major negative, which serves as a good transition back into what I was talking about earlier. No matter how I spin it, project it, or scout it, Troy Smith was 6 feet tall, flat. He was 6 feet tall then, he's 6 feet tall in the hypothetical, and he would be 6 feet tall in the NFL. For some teams, that's a deal breaker. For teams like the Giants, whose coach has brain worms, that may take Smith off the board entirely. However, as I've illustrated, the league has changed at least a few of their draft tendencies since 2007. I don't think that being 6 feet tall in 2019 hurt Smith nearly as much as it did in 2007, and that brings us to the final question that drove this whole hypothetical. With the NFL running more progressive offenses than ever, and drafting more quarterbacks regardless of height than ever, is Troy Smith a first-round pick in this 2019 hypothetical draft? That's unfortunately something that I can't answer with projections or film study. The NFL draft is subjective and it's extremely difficult to speak definitively about, as we see in the thousands of mock drafts that hit correctly on maybe 8 total picks in each draft's first round. That, paired with the purely hypothetical nature of this entire piece, makes it difficult to state anything but opinion here, and the same would be true if I were to reach out to a draftnik or NFL expert. All of it is, at the end, an opinion. Because it's my video and I can do what I want, I'm going to tell you what I think after spending probably 80 hours on research and writing for this. I think Troy Smith got jobbed. I think he deserved so much better than the 5th round, the Ravens, and a career that saw him just start 8 total games in the span of 4 years. I think that in an ideal world, Troy's talent is utilized in an era of football where offenses are wide open, and not where the NFL is so terrified of screwing up that it drafts Drew Stanton 3 full rounds before it drafts Troy Smith. I like to think that in 2019 that's probably the case. I like to think that Troy Smith probably goes 11th to Cincinnati, 13th to Miami, 20th to Denver, or even 32nd to New England. As I said, there's no way for me to prove that he would, and there's no way for me to prove that he wouldn't. That's the blessing and curse of hypotheticals. What I do know, and what I can say for a fact, is that Troy Smith was a tremendous football player during his time at Ohio State, and I sure would have liked to see him given a fair shot at showing off that talent for a little bit longer at the highest level of the sport.